Hello, welcome to From the World Up. I'm Holly March, and I'm going to use my amateur history knowledge to help you with your world building. Today, we're talking about slavery. To most English speakers, slavery is synonymous with the violation of Africa by the Christian West. In their fight for global dominance, Western European countries decimated an entire continent. Holland was fighting Spain, England was fighting France, and Italy was desperate for recognition in any way. African people were considered to be a commodity. At first, only prisoners of war were exported by merchants. After that, as the different countries started to be conquered, they became little more than exports. Gold, ivory, jewels, and people. Cotton and people, and in many ways cotton was considered the more precious thing to buy. If you are going to use slavery in the context of how it has decimated a place, a world, or a country, then Africa is the best place to consider. Large arable areas, watered by complex irrigation systems, had no men left to work the fields. They became fallow, they became dry, and eventually there was a dust bowl effect. That is why the Sahara has spread as far as it has. Entire generations were taken. This means that religions were lost, cultures were lost, languages lost. When they were taken to their new place, they were assigned Christian names, losing their very identity. There was also the loss of history, as many of these tribal areas, like the ancient Celts, had oral tradition rather than written tradition. And since there was a stopgap in the people who would pass their stories on, entire stories and histories have been lost. So you need to consider the way that slavery can affect the land, the way that it affects the people themselves. Generations of enslavement and being treated as a suppressed people leads to the kind of violence that has happened in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And however you feel about that, you have to accept that if you spent 200 years being treated like a thing instead of a person, you are going to fight back. If you try and write somebody who believes in a people the way that the Western Europeans and Americans believed African people to be, you are going to really struggle to make them sympathetic. They will need to arc very quickly if you want people to continue reading your book. The next section is going to be quite difficult to hear. I recommend that you skip ahead if you struggle listening to graphic detail. You have to consider that when people consider other people to be beneath them, you get a huge amount of sexual abuse. From the boats where they were hung up and raped and then thrown overboard, to the fact that children were considered fashionable as pages for about 5 years in London in the 1700s, and then when they became unfashionable, they were just got rid of. In America, a black person, a slave, was considered to be 3/5 of a human being. They were not considered actual people. As recently as the last century, there were people in rural areas of Wales, for example, who thought that blackness would rub off. That was why black people had paler palms, not because melanin, but because it was some kind of physical thing that just came off. You have to consider the fact that there are people who would rather die than be a good, than rather be sold. And there's a beautiful example of that in Black Panther, when Killmonger says that he wishes to be buried at sea with the people who committed suicide rather than be owned. And it was a better option. Apart from the debasement in shipping, they often arrived ill, with dysentery, starved because there wasn't enough food for the people and the crew were considered more important. Soiled goods were thrown overboard rather than be taken into market, because then they would sell at a loss. There were examples of people doing this, of throwing entire shipments of people in chains over into the sea. And this wasn't really considered a bad thing. It was a legal battle, not a moral battle, about whether they were committing fraud on the insurance documents. And that is how Western European people thought of black people, of African people. And if you're going to write that, and you are not a person of colour, I would recommend you be extremely careful. You do your research, you back it up, because this happened. This isn't just something to be exploited even further for selling books. But as I say, if you are going to write this kind of slavery of any culture or a different country that has, or a different, fantasy race that has been treated in this way, consider what it does to the land itself, what it does to history and language, and what it does in the long term to how people feel after the slavery. Also consider the fact that still, even in Africa, some schools forbid African girls to wear their hair naturally. They are forced to braid it down because their beautiful curly hair is considered somehow wrong or immodest. So they have to either cover it or braid it down tightly, even today. And that is in their own country, their own continent, I apologise. And that's over 200 years after slavery was abolished, in England at least. It doesn't just go overnight. Those kind of things are ingrained in people. And so you must respect that. You must respect that this is not some ancient thing. Slavery is still, especially in America, where slavery, it was, I think, only 150 years ago abolished. It is going to hurt people, and people will get angry, and they will deserve to get angry. You will deserve any negative press or comments if you do not treat this with utmost respect. Another example of the negative effects of slavery continuing long after the slavery itself would be Haiti. After the Spanish decimated and enslaved the indigenous Taino people there, they imported a huge amount of black slaves and forced them to Christianization, specifically Catholicism, and forced labour in the fields of plantations. But after the very famous and very successful revolution in 1804, which freed not only the people of Haiti, but many of the surrounding islands, these plantations continued, and so did the forced labour. Those who had revolted and formed the new government considered them necessary for the survival of the country, the only way that they could compete and continue to export. Slavery continued in a place where there had been a slave revolt. And this time it wasn't that, in the case, such as in the case of the Roman revolt of Spartacus, that it had been put down. These people just looked around at the, again, Western European countries who continued with slavery and recognized that they could not compete in exports. And if they did not have exports, the country would die. So they continued slavery. They have continued it to this day, in fact. While plantation work is no longer existent, they have unpaid domestic servants called restaveks. And these people are these positions are rife with sexual abuse of adults, women and children. And child trafficking is also a massive problem. Now, although the government has signed international treaties declaring that it no longer allows slavery, every time a government force becomes closer to eradicating slavery, There have been earthquakes, there have been hurricanes, and all of the money that the country does or does not have has to go into relief efforts and into rebuilding. And that makes it very difficult for the government to maintain a task force specific to rooting out slavery. That would work very well in a fantasy setting. Not only for natural disasters, but unnatural ones. If you have an evil college of wizards always messing everything up, it becomes difficult for the government to look after the people on the bottom rungs of the ladder. Another big thing to consider is how slavery can continue as a culture changes. For this, I'm going to start with the Vikings. They started out as raiders preying on weaker targets like monasteries. They were a warrior caste culture, so anybody who turned of age became a warrior for their lord. This meant that when they were off fighting, there was no one down in the fields doing all the hard work. So they actually had a season for fighting. But as these warriors became sailors and explored further, that season expanded because you couldn't always guarantee the weather. So they started bringing slaves back from the places they raided, frequently seaside targets, small villages, monasteries, things like that, and bringing them back to work the fields, or to become scribes in some cases, and then to be sold on to other cultures. A Christian monk who'd been taught to write would fetch a high price somewhere else that had Christianity. There was a religious disparity at first. Obviously, the Vikings were pagan, so they kind of found it amusing from accounts and chronicles that these Christian people seemed to support a practice of meekness and non-violence, because of course that just made everything easier. And since their heaven was based on fighting in battle, you only get into Valhalla if you fight in glorious battle, otherwise you go to a miserable hell world. Whereas in Christian culture, of course, if you are meek and obedient and sweet, then you go to heaven, but if you are violent and cruel, then you go to hell. That disparity is very important if in a fantasy context, because it can make it easier for you to have somebody who has owned someone without it being a horrific thing. You can use that for humour. I know, talking about slavery and humour in the same place, not easy, but again, please remember that I'm doing this for a narrative thing, not a moral thing. Anyway, as the Vikings grew in number, they started to spread out, both to England, and in this case I'm going to talk about the way that they spread east, out to the Kievan Rus, which is now Russia, or West Russia. Slavery continued there long after the Vikings or Varangians had been absorbed into Russia as a whole, long after Christianization. In the early 1300s, when there was a massive famine in Veliki Novgorod, people sold their children, not for the money, but because if you sold somebody in Russia, then you could ensure their survival. If you owned a slave, you had to be able to support them. You had to clothe them, shelter them, feed them. And that has carried on through the Viking slavery and become something a little bit more wholesome. This is the kind of thing that I would recommend if you must write slavery in your fantasy novel. This is where you come in, at the place where you can earn your freedom, where you can be protected to a degree if you are a slave, where there is social accountability for those who treat their slaves poorly. It wasn't as much in place in Russia as it was in Marrakech, but I will get to Arabic slavery in a bit. One of the important things in the Kievan Russian one to consider is that no matter what class you were, if you're a noble, if you're a boyar, which is middle class, kinda, if you married a slave, you lost standing. They didn't gain it. So you would have to really love a slave in order to marry them and lose the political and hierarchical standing that your birth had given you. Kievan Rus was very rigid in its class system. But that is a discussion for another time. But the main takeaway I want to bring up is that although the Vikings started by enslaving people into bondsmen, at least by the time it came to Kievan Rus, these indentured workers got housing. They were supported. They were not treated the way that black slaves were on the plantations. They had rights of their own. Anyway, and that brings me onto medieval Arabia. The 12th century Arabic world was huge, and from one side to the other, slavery was not only permitted, it was just a way of life. But they also included something called a mukharaja. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. This is book learning, not street learning. The mukharaja was a contract between master and slave that protected their civil rights and dictated how they could earn their freedom. This arrangement meant that people could have a second job. It meant that they could make stuff, and how much of that stuff belonged to the master and how much they could sell themselves. Many masters would purchase people to save them from poverty, and then they could work until they had enough money to buy their freedom back. One of the few dictums was that they could not enslave fellow Muslims. While slaves could convert, and this was encouraged but not forced, Christianity, I hope you're listening, you could not enslave a fellow Muslim if they were already a Muslim. That is something to consider, of course, whether or not an elf will enslave an elf, whether or not an orc will indenture an orc, or indeed whether they can only indenture somebody of their own race / species, depending on how you approach it. You need to consider that if this kind of slavery is what you're going for, that civil rights are protected. If you're going to write slavery in a fantasy book, seriously, go for this model. Look into it. It is the closest that slavery has come to working because of the existence of the mukharaja, because of the existence of the law that you could not forcibly convert a Muslim. They had to come to it themselves if they wanted to. But to make you consider things for your world building and linguistic problems, the word slave actually comes from the word Slav because of the huge trade between Slavic Russia and the Arabic world. To give you an idea of that, it is 4,759 miles, kilometers. I know that when I looked it up, it was kilometers, between Veliki Novgorod and Marrakech. If you walked constantly, without stopping, it would take you 40 days and 11 hours. That's without rest. To be that far from your homeland would be terrifying. The language would be different unless that you are including a concept of a common language, like there is in Dungeons and Dragons. But also the culture is completely different. The food is different. The weather is different. I'm going to go into weather systems at a later date. But consider that. Consider the fact that in Arabic, the word for white people is ruddy people, because all of the white people they met at the time that language was being developed would get sunburned. So while we consider ourselves, inverted commas, white people, Arabic people consider us as sunburned people. And let's face it, most Brits on holiday, that certainly makes sense. So how people consider themselves once they are enslaved, they are considered a different way. You can include things about certain groups not being trusted as much. That usually happens. There's always some reason not to distrust someone who's not the same as you. At least not so much a reason as an excuse. So consider that certain slave groups might not get on with other slave groups. An elf who is enslaved might not trust an orc who is enslaved in the same household. Now that is the main part of my Arabic thing. I really recommend you research Arabic slavery if you are going to do a slavery model within your world, because it is the only way you're going to get people to sympathize with slavers. The only way. And even then, just don't try and make a slaver a hero unless he's going to change Han Solo style. Just don't. If you're going to include slavery, I'm hoping that you're also going to include its abolition in your world. This can come either slowly through a switch to feudalism, through a caste system where the indentured or bonded workers or serfs have little to no rights and are at the very bottom of the food chain, hierarchically speaking. This happened in China and in much of Western Europe. In fact, Italy didn't abolish the feudal system and the concept of serfs until the late 12th century. It can come over a number of decades with people like William Wilberforce at the head, who slowly chip away at the merchants who, like the NRA, support the bad, evil industry and manage to win over the populace bit by bit. This can be a very good thing to have in the background, but I wouldn't recommend to make it the main drive of your narrative. If you're going to abolish slavery, the best way to do it, to keep a reader interested and on board, is to do it with a revolt. Excuse me. Either in the manner of Haiti or the manner of Spartacus, but with, slightly more success than Spartacus had. The best way to do this is to have the slaves themselves discover skill sets like magic or fighting or even logistics, which they can use themselves to free themselves, rather than having somebody from the ruling class or an outsider come in and lead them to glorious revolt. If you do the latter, you run the risk of it being like one of those 80s action movies where the white marine comes in, saves everybody, and then rides off on a motorbike with, the village cheering and the token love interest on the back of the bike. That kind of thing is incredibly patronising. It's patronising to me, and I'm Welsh, and you don't get much whiter than Welsh. If you write something like that, even in a fantasy context, it is going to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable or a lot angry. It is really blatant. No matter how subtly you think you've done it, it is really blatant. A good way of doing this is, I know it's weird to praise it, but Ridley Scott's Robin Hood, rather than having Robin be the Earl of Huntingdon, so historically inaccurate, who comes in to save the poor Saxons, he has him as a Saxon who went away, learned how to fight, learned the way of politics, and then returned to stand up for his own people. Doing something like that, or like the start of the Trudy Canavan Dark Magician trilogy, where Sonia realizes that she has magic, and therefore all poor people can have magic. Something like that is far more acceptable and far more narratively interesting. Access to greater magic or greater weapons, anything like that, is going to make your abolition story much more satisfying. And as I say, if you're going to have slavery, write its abolition, because slavery is a terrible, terrible thing. So your homework today is this. Why are there slaves in your world? Was it a massive Roman force sweeping across the world and enslaving anyone who stood up to them? Was it the systematic violation of an entire continent by countries who were vying for control of the oceans? Is it a religious conversion? Is it just that one religion believes that it has a right to own others? Is it an ethnic separation, either between people of different colours or creeds, or between species of different colours and creeds? Is it considered shameful in your slave model for people to mistreat their slaves? If there have been riots or uprisings before, how did they end? And what effect do they have on both slaves and masters? Always remember that in a world where slavery is accepted, Anybody who is asked why they have slaves would be confused by the question itself. It is just a matter of course. Why would you ask? Finally, I would really ask that if you have any feedback on this is my first podcast. If you have advice on the way I present my voice, either speak quicker or speak slower, please feed that back to me. If you have ideas for world-building questions you have that you would like to hear a podcast about, do contact me here or on Twitter at Marchawitch. I'd really like to hear from people. And if you want to discuss it, please do, because obviously this is something that should always be discussed. Thank you, and good luck building your world.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.